President Biden recently issued a formal apology to Native American communities for forcing indigenous children to attend federal Indian boarding schools. That program ended decades ago, but American Indian communities continue to deal with the trauma. And joining us now to talk about her experiences at the Phoenix Indian School is journalist Patty Talahungva. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we should mention that we've worked together in the building for a while, so it's good to see you, but we're going to talk about some really difficult stuff here. And let's just get started with your experiences at these boarding schools. Share what you can.
Well, I think people have this general idea about boarding schools. And so I have had people ask me, were you forced to go to boarding school? And they have this idea that agents were still rounding up kids and bringing them to these schools. But I ask people, what is your definition of forced? In 1978, my tribe did not have a junior high on its reservation or a high school. What were my options? Was I forced to go to boarding school? You know, and I also say it's never a good idea to separate a child from the parent, right? Mm-hmm. So no matter what, no matter the fact that when I went to Phoenix Indian, everyone was speaking their language. So, and we had shared language. You know, we all learned how to tease each other in other languages. We were not told we couldn't speak our language. And there was the Miss Phoenix Indian pageant. So it was a very different time frame. And I think it's important when you ask questions about boarding school, you ask, which decade are you talking about?
And I was going to ask that. Your experiences at Phoenix Indian School, compare those to maybe 30, 40, 50 years prior.
Well, I can compare it to my grandmother's experience. You know, she was sent when she was a little girl, and she was forcibly removed. And she was forced to wear a uniform. She talked to the family years later and talked about how she had to march everywhere as a little child because these schools were built on this military model. And so those impacts, those influences of military stayed with the school until Phoenix Indian closed in 1990. So when you were growing up, you probably had a list of chores, right? Mm-hmm. At boarding school, they weren't called chores. It was called detail. And if you ask anybody in the military who's enlisted, they will tell you what their detail is. So even that kind of terminology it was a part of our school. So we had detail, we didn't have chores. We didn't have a janitorial staff because we were the ones who cleaned the school.
Talk to us, and again, if your grandmother's perspective is really important here, but your perspective, you were there, you know, give us an average day. What happened?
Oh gosh, average day. Well, so again, you know, when you think about average day, I was giving this presentation about our, just, you know, having a football game. And when you don't have family in town to show up to those football games, quite often it was the visitor side that was full and our home bleachers were pretty much empty. The students might show up, but more importantly, even the coaches, like Coach Marty Conrad, a wonderful man, he would try to get other coaches or other teachers, to come out to just support us, you know, in our athletics. And the teachers didn't care to show up. So an average day, very hard to define because again, you're not going home. Nobody at the end of the day is saying, are you doing your homework? Did you get things, you know, did you wash your clothes for next week or whenever? So you know, you were left to your own devices.
Yeah, and compare that now with when your grandmother went to a boarding school.
I just, you know, I've been doing a lot of research, and back then there were absolutely no visits. It was hard to get to these boarding schools, and I think about her and her brothers and sisters. My great-grandmother had kids taken away and sent to 3 different boarding schools in 3 different states. And so that broke up the family, and I would say that those family ties were never mended fully. So that's the legacy that we're living with. And we talk about historical trauma, that's what we're referring to.
And you refer to yourself as a survivor as opposed to a graduate, correct?
Yes.
Why?
Well, good question. You know, when I would hear that word or that term, boarding school survivor, I thought, you know, it doesn't apply to me. But as I've learned more about the history, and again, I thought I lived it, I thought I knew it, but until I started seeing the records, I started realizing this systemic effort by our government to separate us, to, you know, tell us everything about us as Native people was bad, So from our hair to our clothing to our religions, when you go through that process and your family has gone through that process and we're still here, we're still standing, that is being a survivor. So, yes.
The president's apology for those schools last month, your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think, it's not taught in our schools, this history of boarding school. It's not taught in any decent coverage. And so I think the average American was wondering, what is he apologizing for? So maybe that was an opening to help educate Americans. And that includes our political leaders who don't understand the federal to federal relationship that tribes have with the U.S. government. Mm-hmm. And so I think, that was good. I was sitting in the audience wondering if my great-grandmother was there, would she accept the apology?
And?
I don't think she would.
Yeah.
Because look what happened to her family. So I think it's something that needed to be said to acknowledge this history of American government policy. But the big test, the big apology will come when Congress upholds its trust responsibility to tribes. And a lot of people out there don't even know what that means, but Congress owes it to tribes.
And real quickly, we got less than a minute left, so I want to make sure you get this in here, though. Talk about that trust responsibility.
Well, funding healthcare, housing, education, that's what the government promised us. So we haven't ever had any of those treaty responsibilities, those trust responsibilities fulfilled. So,
yes.
There you go.
Well, Patty, thank you so much for joining us and talking about what has to be it has to be bittersweet too, because I'm sure you made friends and I'm sure you had times where you look back and it wasn't horrific, but it wasn't what it's supposed to be for a young person going to school. And I thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you for having me, Ted.